We're going to look at profit versus profitability. What's the difference between gross profit and gross profit margin? Or what's the difference between net profit and net profit margin? I thought it was important for us to establish that there is a difference between gross profit and gross profit margin. Similarly, net profit is not the same as net profit margin. Let us have a look at this in detail. Gross profit is calculated by taking net sales less cost of goods sold. On the other hand, the gross profit margin is calculated by taking the gross profit as a percentage of net sales. To convert it to percentage, we simply multiply by 100. So looking at the formula itself, we can see that the calculations for gross profit is very different to the calculation for gross profit margin. Secondly, gross profit is measured in dollars, whereas the gross profit margin is measured in percentage. Even though the gross profit and gross profit margin are two different things, there are connections between the two. We will have a look at this by looking at an example. Firstly, let us assume that in year 1, the business has generated net sales of $100. The cost of goods sold was $40. Therefore, the business made a gross profit of $60. If we project that into the gross profit margin calculation, we can see that the gross profit of $60 over the net sales of $100 times 100 will give us a gross profit margin of 60%. Now let's assume that in year 2, the business was able to generate more net sales. This increased to $120. The cost of goods sold expenses also increased to $50. Now this is a possible scenario. For example, perhaps the business has changed suppliers and therefore is paying a little bit more for its inventory. However, maybe the quality has improved and therefore there is a greater demand for the inventory. And that is perhaps why the business was still able to generate more net sales. Now, as we can see here, the gross profit for year 2 works out to be $70. If we put this into the gross profit margin calculation, we will get a gross profit margin of 58% in year 2. Now what I would like you to take note of is this. From year 1 to year 2, we can see that the gross profit has actually increased. However, if we look at the gross profit margin from year 1 to year 2, there was actually a decrease. At this stage, you'd be probably wondering why. In order to understand the possibility of how the gross profit increases whereas the gross profit margin decreases, let us have a look at the gross profit margin formula, because I believe that this will give us a clearer idea as to how the gross profit and the net sales and how these changes affect the gross profit margin. So in a general sense, for the gross profit margin to increase, there would either be an increase in gross profit or a decrease in net sales. Sometimes both of these changes may happen at the same time, leading to an increase in gross profit margin in effect. On the other hand, it could be possible for the gross profit margin to go down, and that would be due to the decrease in gross profit or an increase in net sales. Now, as I've mentioned in the past, there is a logical mathematical explanation to this, and I've mentioned before that anything above the fraction at the top of the fraction has a positive relationship to the financial indicator. So specific to this example, we can see that the gross profit has a positive relationship with the gross profit margin, which means if there's an increase in gross profit, we can usually expect an increase in gross profit margin, and vice versa. Whereas with the net sales and the gross profit margin, so anything below the fraction, at the bottom of the fraction, it has the opposite relationship to the financial indicator. So in this case here, the net sales has the opposite relationship to the gross profit margin, which means for the gross profit margin to increase, we could expect that it was due to a decrease in net sales. So in summary here, what we can see is that any changes to the gross profit can affect the gross profit margin. Any changes to the net sales can also affect the gross profit margin. Now, in reality, the gross profit and the net sales would be changing within the period. So the question is, what was the proportion of the change in the gross profit? And was it an increase or decrease? We also need to establish what was the proportion of change in the net sales, and was it an increase or decrease? Using our example here, we can see that we had a decrease in gross profit margin. Our gross profit actually increased from $60 to $70. Our net sales also changed, and it was actually an increase from $100 to $120. Using our mathematical logical understanding from the previous slide, we would have expected an increase in gross profit to lead to an increase in gross profit margin. But this is not the case here. This is because the change in the net sales, in this case here, the increase in the net sales also has an effect on the gross profit margin. So again, from what we understand earlier, any increase in net sales leads to a decrease in gross profit margin. So looking at what we have here in this scenario, it looks like it is possible, and it is in fact the case, that the change in the net sales is the bigger factor here that is causing the decrease in gross profit margin. In other words, the increase in net sales was a bigger proportion compared to the increase in gross profit. For those who enjoy looking at the solid evidence, the mathematical evidence for this, let us have a look at the percentage of change in the gross profit. So the gross profit actually increased by $10. And if we compare it to the 16, this was actually an increase of 16%. Whereas the net sales was an increase of $20, and comparing it to the original 100, this was actually an increase in net sales by 20%. So this confirms our understanding that the net sales has increased in greater proportion than the increase in gross profit. And that is why overall this has led to a decrease in gross profit margin. So hopefully from this example here and this explanation here, you're able to see that there is a difference between gross profit and gross profit margin. But they do have a connection to one another. But it's important to not automatically assume that the increase in gross profit would lead to the increase in gross profit margin. The key factor here is for us to note that we also need to look at the change in the net sales in order to make that analysis clearer. So the discussion we've had to explain the difference as well as the connection between gross profit and gross profit margin can also be applied to help us understand the difference and connection between net profit and net profit margin. To calculate the net profits, we take revenues minus expenses. Whereas on the other hand, the net profit margin is calculated by taking the net profit over net sales. Again, net profit is expressed in dollars, whereas the net profit margin is expressed as a percentage. As we have discussed earlier, we can establish that any changes in the net profit can have an effect on the net profit margin. But we can't stop there, because we also need to consider the changes in the net sales before we are able to fully analyze the change in net profit margin. In summary, gross profit is different to gross profit margin, and net profit is different to net profit margin. So gross profit and net profit measures profit, whereas gross profit margin and net profit margin are measures of profitability. Profit is measured in dollars, whereas profitability is measured in percentages. Lastly, we need to understand that profitability is basically measuring the business ability to generate profits in a relative comparison to a base. In this case here, for gross profit margin and net profit margin, it is the ability of the business to generate profits as a percentage of the net sales that we are given.